Hello, everyone, and welcome to my presentation titled Recasting the Conversation about Learner Autonomy at the School of Languages at XJTLU Symposium today. My name is Thomas Stringer, and I will be the presenter. I wanted to be here in person, but unfortunately it didn't match my teaching schedule. But if everything goes well, I'll be able to join live for the Q&A session at the end. So I hope to see some of you live then, okay? Before I begin, let me talk a little bit about myself, brief bio. So I've been an English language teacher for about 15 years, since 2008 in Japan. I'm currently a full-time instructor in English as a foreign language at the Language Center of Kwansei Gakuin University in Hyogo, Japan. And I'm also a doctoral student in TESOL, so teaching of English to speakers of other languages at the University of St. Andrews in the UK. I recently became a fellow of the Higher Education Academy, and my research interests are primarily in learner development and teacher development, with a particular focus on autonomy. Okay, so let me give you a little overview now about the contents of today's presentation. So first, I'd like to give a broad summary of what I'll talk about. Then I'll explain some of the research backgrounds related to autonomy. And then I'll discuss some case studies, some exemplars. So they're not real, but they are, I think, instructive for communicating my viewpoint. And then I'll give some concluding remarks, and hopefully we'll have time for the question and answer session. Okay, so as I mentioned, the first thing I want to do is give a kind of overview of the whole presentation. So my main point is that I think there have been some inconsistencies perhaps in how language learner autonomy has been understood, right? So perhaps you're wondering why there are some pictures here on the right side of the slide. First, there's at the top right, the picture of some onion rings, some onions sliced up and diced up over there. And at the bottom right of the slide, we've got some pictures of onions growing in a field. Well, why are they there? So my main point in this presentation is that perhaps we've been adopting too granular or too reductionist of a point of view, and that we've been slicing the onion too thinly rather than developing more novel or holistic pictures of autonomy and how that might help us as language teachers in particular. So what I want to do is to present some exemplar case studies from an EFL context. So I'm an EFL teacher, and I assume many of the people in the audience are too, or many of the people watching at home. And the main point that I want to emphasize is that this viewpoint invites us to reorient ourselves in a holistic sense towards autonomy in terms of how we research it and also how we teach it, right? So in terms of both research and practice, right? So a little bit on, the background first. Okay, so autonomy is not a new concept in language learning. It's had quite a long history, in fact. As I'm sure many of you know, the concept has been talked about in the research for almost 40 years, since the 1980s. And this quote from last year is quite representative. So the goal of language learner autonomy has become an accepted part of language teaching and learning. Okay, so it's there and we've all heard of it. But despite this long history, lots of issues remain, in particular, a lack of clarity about it. So a scoping review from last year, 2022, by Chong and Reinders, identified that the central concept of English language learner autonomy is pretty inconsistently defined in the research, in the literature. So there's a lot of conflation of the concept with ideas from related fields. That might be fields like self-regulation or strategy use, so language learning skills or strategy development or strategy awareness. And there's also a lot of overlap with elements of learner psychology. That might be motivation or learner metacognition, learner beliefs, or how emotions affect learners' autonomy, as well as other related fields like self-access learning. And this lack of conceptual clarity bleeds into our teaching, right? The main impact of it is that we as teachers may not have a clear understanding of exactly what autonomy is, or whether we should care about it, or whether we should prioritize it in our classrooms at all. Okay, so there's been a long history of this idea of language learner autonomy in language education, but there's a lot of inconsistencies in the literature, and that causes problems for teachers. Okay, so as I mentioned before, today I wanted to introduce two case studies, two exemplar case studies that I think are illustrative or instructive of these different ways of viewing or thinking about language learner autonomy. Now, these case studies are not real; they're figurative ones, but I think they're still helpful for us to understand these two situations that might be quite familiar to us. Right? So you can see here on the screen, I've got the silhouette of an instructor, an EFL instructor, and also I've got our sliced onions, this picture again. So perhaps I can give you a little idea about which setup, which conceptual setup this case study is based on. So let me move the slide on. So we've got a teacher, an EFL teacher, and let's call her Miss P for the sake of argument. And Miss P is very, very experienced. She has many years of experience in the classroom, and she's leading two EFL classes currently. And being an experienced instructor, she is observant and notices things about her students. In particular, she begins to notice that perhaps some are more independent of learners than others. And of course, she wonders why. And when checking her attendance register, she also sees that, some of them have spotty attendance. Perhaps they don't come regularly, and maybe they are acting out or behaving poorly, in other words, when they do come there. So she becomes interested in investigating her class a little bit more. And so Miss P decides to investigate language learner autonomy in her classes and how that might relate to her students' motivation to learn and perhaps to their behavior as well. So she decides that she's going to conduct a 6-week study in her classes, and she decides to go for a quantitative research study. So she designs what we might call an experimental study because she has two classes, right? And she's very lucky as a teacher because she has non-teaching time set aside, which may be rare for some of us, and access to some academic journals or professional literature. And so she decides to do some background reading on the literature on language learner autonomy so that she can better design her own study. And so eventually Miss P finds a few studies that she likes and she decides to replicate them, to copy them. And so she will set one class as the experimental group and the other class as the control group. So the experimental group will receive explicit instruction once a week on how to develop their language learner autonomy, whereas the other class, the control group, will not receive any similar instruction and they will just do their typical classroom activities. And from her background research, from reading the literature, Miss P decides to measure language learner autonomy and motivation with these two instruments that she finds in the literature, the LAC questionnaire, the Learner Autonomy Centered Knowledge Questionnaire, and the MAP, the Motivation Awareness Profile. Now, these are both fictitious instruments that I created for this case study, but they represent the typical kind of instruments that you find there in the literature. They're widely used, they're considered reliable and valid, and students report their perceptions of their own autonomy on the lack related to learning goals or seeking out resources or they're monitoring their progress, right? So in the map, the motivation awareness profile, it's measuring various aspects of their motivation, right? Because Miss P noticed in her research that autonomy is frequently linked to psychological qualities like motivation. Okay, so Miss P gives this lack in the map to the classes and then teaches the experimental group how to set learning goals, how to effectively use learning resources, and how to monitor their own progress. Miss P also takes her cue from the literature and decides to use parametric tests, perhaps a t-test, as was recommended, to compare the lack and map pre and post-test means of the class's scores. But unfortunately, she doesn't find any evidence that the experimental group had significantly higher lack or map scores than the control group. And so, of course, she concludes that she was the problem, that her teaching was the problem, and not with the instruments or with the approach to research in general. And of course, she concludes that, her instruction was at fault. So it was not effective in increasing autonomy or addressing those behavioral or attendance issues that we mentioned before. Okay, so now let's look at the second case study. So perhaps these pictures here are a clue about which conceptual perspective this case study is presented from. You can see the onions here with their roots stretching down to the ground, the bulb on the surface, and then we can see all the way up to the tip there and the background of the field that they're in, this more holistic view, right? So our teacher, Miss P, some time has passed and she's had an opportunity to reflect more on her classroom research, and she wasn't deterred by her previous experience. So eventually, she decides to try again, and she's going to rethink her entire approach from the ground up. So at the start of the new school year, Miss P resolves to try a mixed methods project across the same two classrooms with a group of, two new groups of students. And this time, instead, she resolves to treat each group, each class, as its own little nexus over the academic year and try to be patient, exploratory, and reflective in her approach. And she's not going to just take an off the shelf study design or methodology that she got from the research, from her reading. Now, something else that Miss P decided to do from this, new attitude that she has is to engage in negotiations with the different stakeholders who are related to her class. So that means the parents, that means other teachers, the students themselves, and the school administrators, all to different degrees. Okay. So by doing this, Miss P hopes to develop a deeper, more holistic picture of her students, of their needs, and her response. So first, she resolves to learn really, really deeply about her new students. That means their backgrounds, their interests, before she even considers starting her research project, before making any research decisions. And she talks to them regularly to learn about their lives outside of the classroom and to learn, exactly what kind of opportunities they do have for studying, because she wants to be inclusive. So she tries to negotiate the timetable of learning activities, perhaps when they set learning goals, or what topics are covered in the class, how the class is taught, or even how the class might be assessed. It could even be how the furniture is arranged in the classroom might evolve on an ongoing basis over the course of the academic year. So she advises her students based on her expert knowledge as a teacher and on her new, deeper understanding of her students' background, personal interests, their situation, their abilities. And using this, she's able to help each student individually with their different learning strategies that they might try, different technologies that might suit them, to find ones that suit their needs and abilities. Now, Miss P also consults with other subject teachers who teach the same students about their interactions with the same students. And by sharing ideas from their different disciplines and perhaps from their different teaching styles, they build up a more holistic picture of the learners. Now, Miss P still wants to use these tools that she found in the literature. She still wants to measure change systematically in her classes using the LAC questionnaire, the Learner Autonomy Centered Knowledge Questionnaire. But for the sake of ease, she opts not to also use the motivation awareness profile, keeping things manageable for herself. Another decision she makes is to be tentative, right? To engage in careful cycles of observation, perhaps developing some initial exploratory questions that she wants to investigate, engage in some rounds of negotiation with different stakeholders, offer some opportunities for each to reflect on how things are going, and analyze that process as well before even considering using this LAC questionnaire. Another thing that's different in her methodological approach is that Miss P didn't divide the classes into control and experimental group. Instead, she's treating each class as unique and is using this LAC periodically within each class to measure change within that class. So Miss P decides not to try and interpret those results of the test or even to use the t-tests as she tried to before, because it's not so meaningful in her context for herself or for the learners. Instead, she decides to combine these questionnaire results with her own observations of the students' behavior, with those reports from the other teachers, perhaps with other stakeholder feedback or other information like test scores, language test scores. So this iterative analysis taking place over the course of the year, where the findings are feeding into her teaching, into her approach to the class, to the strategy or technology advice that she gives to the students, is evolving, right? And perhaps some stakeholders struggled at points with this kind of unexpected or perceived unplanned progression of the class or outcomes. So Miss P is very careful to manage their expectations about linear progress towards autonomy, or indeed that this project might produce results that have any meaning that could be generalized beyond this context. Instead, she emphasizes that it's an open-ended project and that they're trying to produce local evidence that's meaningful for those people there. So generally, people enjoy being part of this exploratory project because it's participatory and inclusive, because Miss P was careful to build consensus and promote an empowering and encouraging environment. And in that environment, the conditions are more likely to align in order to promote the emergence of these individual instances of autonomous learning. As the academic year comes to an end, Miss P eventually reflects that she worked more closely than ever before with these different stakeholders, right? With her colleagues, with the students, with the parents, through all of these negotiations. And by collecting data from these multiple sources, she was able to eventually report that she got a much more nuanced understanding of her students' learning. And although not everyone developed, of course, in the same way, her students felt invested in this development. They went beyond the minimum, and some of them even developed their own learning styles inside and outside of the classroom. Miss P is happy that she combined these diverse kinds of quantitative and qualitative forms of information because they helped inform decisions about her teaching and helped her better support her students' autonomy and her students' language development. It's this inclusive approach and responsive approach that facilitated these personalized forms of autonomy that emerged in this classroom based on each learner's unique goals and abilities. So the main point is that these reductionist, theoretical, conceptual, research or teaching approaches may not be best suited to investigating as complex a phenomenon as language learner autonomy inside or outside the classroom. And instead, conceptually, we need to view language learner autonomy as an ecosystem. It's a series of these dynamic or networked relationships between these different states and changes occur across this network, across this ecosystem, and they happen in kind of unpredictable ways. And so, really, this is a strong argument for action research by teachers in the classroom to investigate language learner autonomy, and also the use of exploratory teaching methods to promote this emergence of language learner autonomy in this context. Here you can see my references, and with any luck, I'll be able to join you now live to talk about this presentation in the Q&A session. So thank you very much for your attention.